Yes. Mr. Faisal, do you listen?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you
Oh
hear
yeah,
me?
okay, yeah, I can hear you clearly. I just want to check if you want to share the screen from your end, or do you want? Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second Talking ASEAN webinar, where we'll be unpacking key takeaways from the 56th ASEAN Foreign Ministers Meeting, or AMM, and discuss what these takeaways mean for ASEAN unity. My name is Mabda, and I am a researcher at the Habibie Center, and I will be moderating today's discussion. The AMM serves as the primary channel for discussions on political security, cooperation, as well as ASEAN's relations with external parties. The AMM has historically served as an important platform for interesting exchanges. And for the AMM this year, it was particularly situated amidst various interesting and at times concerning developments, both within ASEAN member states, between member states, and of course beyond ASEAN, which in one way or another affect the concerns and direction of ASEAN dialogues. Within ASEAN member states, we are seeing lots of interesting domestic political developments and at times turmoils, such as what we are seeing right now in Thailand as well as Cambodia, and to some extent what we will see as well in Indonesia for the next few months before the election. And outside of ASEAN, tensions between the US and China continue to persist as they work towards continuing dialogues, particularly military to military dialogues. Beyond the brief handshake between their defense ministers or secretaries during the Shangri-La dialogues, them being adamant on the conditionalities for dialogue still hampers natural high-level dialogue from happening. And these conditionalities being lifting sanctions on Li Shangfu, for example, the Chinese defense minister, or rejection to discuss Taiwan. And as we are speaking, Henry Kissinger is currently on a so-called secret trip to Beijing, for example, where he met leading figures such as Wang Yi and Li Shangfu, which, yeah, it is no longer a secret, but it's so-called secret meeting, uh, which many observers have likened to what Kissinger had done more than 50 years ago to thaw US-China relations. And we will see what the outcome of the meetings will be. But to discuss all of these interesting developments as well as how it relates to ASEAN, and particularly the key takeaways from the AMM, we have three speakers joining us, both offline and online. First, we have Rolliansyah Soemirat, who is currently the Director for ASEAN Political Security Cooperation at the Indonesian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was previously the Director for International Security and Disarmament, and has also previously been assigned for diplomatic positions at the Permanent Mission of Indonesia to the UN in New York, as well as the Permanent Mission to the UN, WTO, and other international organizations in Geneva. And we also have Dr. Faisal Karim, who is the editor in international relations of the Journal of ASEAN Studies, one of the leading ASEAN journals, not only in Indonesia, but also the world. And he is also currently an assistant professor in international relations at Binus Nusantara University. He earned his PhD from the University of Warwick and was a fellow at the Central European University and the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin. And last but not least, we also have Mr. Muhammad Faizal bin Abdul Rahman, who is a research fellow with the Regional Security Architecture Program, the Institute of Defense and Strategy Studies at the RSIS Singapore. He also has extensive experience in the Singaporean government, serving in the Singapore Ministry of Home Affairs and National Security Coordination Secretariat, and was also involved in the Ministry of Communications and Information. So all of these three speakers will discuss a lot of the developments that we have seen with the AMM and also the context that underlies the AMM and what's going to happen leading to the ASEAN Summit in September. So of course, this seminar will begin with 10-minute presentations from each of the speakers, where they will share their perspective on the outcome of the AMM, and we will be followed by a discussion and as well as Q&A session, both with audiences joining us offline and online. And for everyone joining from YouTube, everyone is welcome to ask questions as well as raise any sort of comments or points via the live chat feature on YouTube. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Pak Rolliansyah Soemirat to begin his presentation on outlining key takeaways from the AMM. Pak Roy, the floor is yours.
Terima kasih very much. Since this is still considered as a hybrid meeting, instinctively I always start by saying good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, just in case some of you joining us from different times. Although of course now we are coming back slowly again, so-called instant way of meetings, but again we can manage the kind of hybrid. But on behalf of Ambassador Arto Suryodipuro, Director General of ASEAN Cooperations, some leaders of Indonesia, Foreign Ministry, I would like to thank Habibie Center for inviting gathering. I have limitations of mandate actually from Ambassador Arto as my direct supervisor, that practically I'm trying to present much as possible information that I can. Though of course at the same time there are also several issues. Let's just say on progress that I will no liberty in conveying it openly, but having a luxury of this kind of discussion where the Chatham House, particularly maybe I have some room online, even better. So it's going to. I mean, I will differentiate between my own personal view and my views with regard to the foreign policy. But let's. I have several presentations, only just help discussion later. The first thing that I need to discuss is that the so-called ASEAN ministerial meeting, post-ministerial, that practically is the most difficult part. I mean, some of you may be more familiar with particular forum. I mean, we are talking about summit, but summit is different game, different reality. Practically, sometimes the issue or discussion is reach the peak, the top of the discussion. But the ministerial meeting and the post-ministerial conference, one that shaping all the discussions that later on will be material, or later on will be adopted, agreed in the summit level. And we are going to have a summit very soon, the early part of September, 43rd summit of. So you might see in the screen there are at least 24 formal meeting convened last week in a span of 4 days. Even some of the meeting was conducted in parallel, and from the 24, only 2 meeting that is not conducted in the ministerial level. The rest practically conducted in the ministerial level. So that intense, that important, the so-called AMMPM meeting every year for ASEAN community. And of course, again, with regard to the meeting itself, you might see particular. But let's just say the most important part is that this particular format is allowing ASEAN member states to have a proper discussion among ASEAN foreign ministers internally, 10 ASEAN 10 minus 1 plus 1. Because we have the problem now with regard to the participation in Myanmar, because under the current, our leaders already decided that I think ASEAN foreign minister. But at the same time, we have our observer, Timor Leste, standing in ministerial level. Minus 1 for the ASEAN internal meeting. And then after that, we have various meetings, ASEAN foreign minister and its counterpart. You name it. You see ASEAN partners. Plus, the most interesting part also, for some of you who have special attention, is the meeting of ASEAN foreign minister with their East Asia Summit ministerial counterpart, as well as one of the biggest ASEAN regional. Nothing new from this. The forum, the format is already. Let's check that. This is the so-called the formal outcome deliverables that already been agreed throughout the series of. Mostly are negotiated text. Means the draft is not only just a summary of the chair of Indonesia chair. No, practically most of the document are negotiated text. Although some of the outcome is also not really fully negotiated in terms of we try to be as democratic as possible, giving some room, some possible input from respective partners. But at the end of the day, still for some document, the chair still have some looks to shape the. You can see that there are so many document, either thematic document connected to specific topics, or the one that considered an umbrella document that will consist of various issues. One of the biggest and most important part from the perspective is, of course, is the joint communique, because that is so-called the only negotiated text agreed by all ASEAN members, and it can be referenced our activity, various forum, various issues. I can just some example. I can take some example. Aside from the joint communique, we have ASEAN Maritime Outlook has already been noted by our minister. Hopefully to be noted again in the summit month time. Actually, ASEAN Maritime Outlook is Indonesian initiative. This is coming from the understanding up to now there is no one single document in ASEAN that practically becoming a mother, the umbrella of document that will connect all 12 sectors of ASEAN maritime cooperation. So we hope that by the issuance of the ASEAN Maritime Outlook, at least ASEAN can have one particular document, specific Bible, if I may say so, how we should cooperate with regard to the maritime issue in our region, as well as how we are going to cooperate with our partners. So our partners can check, can take a look in this maritime outlook, whether they have some kind of similarities or let's say convergence to how they are going to convene maritime cooperation. Then there is also another ASEAN-China joint statement on important for China. Then there is one that is always being frequently asked question from media, especially with regard to the so-called South China Sea Code of Conduct, the discussions on it. We managed to adopt a guidelines that practically will be our reference in how to accelerate the discussion on South China Sea. The Code of Conduct discussion is because it's already entering 4th years, and actually I have to admit that pace is not as fast as expected. That's why we consider this guidance is important to accelerate the finalization of the Code of Conduct. Then we have Asia Summit Plan of Actions for 28. And there are some several joint statements with partners. Yeah, I think I already can pass it later. Specific document outcome of the. But the next slide, I think, is going to be my focus. Our president always emphasized that ASEAN should not be a place for proxy war, and all cooperation, all activities conducted in ASEAN should be confined with a win-win framework. That's why even President last Friday morning courtesy call meeting Jakarta, and he mentioned importance ng tanpa winning without distracting others. It means again this is the framework of thinking that we try to emphasize in. I have 6 at least, or even 7 takeaways from last week MMP. First, in order to face a current and future challenges, it's going to be very imperative that ASEAN should always reflect internally and make necessary adjustment with regard to its working method, with regard to what do you call it, fit situation. So, and in this regard, we managed to emphasize the importance of possibility, not possibility. We are in the planning of having ASEAN Concord 4 to be adopted summit. Work is about how this Concord can be a guidance for all ASEAN member states in creating or formulating a new vision. Since we are going to have our new vision after 2020. Guided by the ASEAN Concord, the new ASEAN Concord, that will give a direction how we are going to make sure that we are capable enough, we are fit enough to fit challenges, not only the current challenges, but we have to see how the challenges will come in 20 years. We should be able to see what will be the problem, not from the current point of view, but in the future. It's easy talk, but I realize because sometimes when we are trying to make a prediction, we have the different approach among ASEAN members, which kind of future that we have to deal with. Then the second contribution is about the ASEAN itself should always be a main contributor to the region, even beyond. I always being asked by public whether ASEAN still relevant. Of course, it's difficult questions. Can only answer. Can you imagine our region without ASEAN for the last 50 years? The fact that ASEAN member states managed to arrange their collective behavior and avoiding open war with some problem, hiccups here and there. at least is already another evidence ASEAN contributing to the world. At least, but this is the thing that we are trying always. Therefore, we aside from having this kind of guidelines for the code of conduct in South China Sea, then we try to formulate ASEAN Maritime Outlook. We also try to give another push for the Southeast Asia and nuclear weapon-free zones discussions, because it is time actually for ASEAN to bring the issue forward again. And again, most important part is we need to make sure that we contribute regional peace. ASEAN is already recognized as the convening power. I forgot to mention earlier, during the 4 days of ministerial meeting last week, we count not less than 239 bilaterals meeting convened among all those participants. It means everybody wants to come to ASEAN gathering and maximize the meeting in order for them to have some kind of direct meeting with their counterpart. Internal ASEAN and also with partners. The third takeaway is about we try to inject the ideas about the imperative of changing, not changing, maybe strengthening the ASEAN-led mechanism, in particular ASEAN Regional Forum. It's already been 30 years convened, but maybe now it is time for ARF to implement it in a more robust way in accordance with terms of reference 30 years ago. We have confidence building measures of ARF. Then the second one, we have the preventive diplomacy. Then the third one, the conflict prevention. But for the last 30 years, ASEAN Regional Forum only stopped in the first stage, the confidence building measure. It is actually quite simple for us. So that's why Indonesia is not hesitate to remind that it is time to maximize the potential on the ARF, not only in the CBM area, but even to prevent conflict, format of preventive. We will work with some partners in order to materialize this part. And then the next one is the epicentrum of growth. We try to emphasize the importance of cooperations in the region with regard to the health architecture, and then the energy, and then the food security, as well as the financial stability. That's the issue that we bring in all those meetings, not only ASEAN internal, but also ASEAN with its partners. And it can be actually seen in the list of the document. There are so many documents directly connected: food security, energy security, financial stability, as well as the health architecture. The fifth take-out is about the mainstreaming of an ASEAN Outlook of Indo-Pacific. Also something that is very important for us, because now everybody has their own definition about Indo-Pacific. But sorry to say, for ASEAN member states, when it comes to the implementation of so-called concept of Indo-Pacific in the region, the only thing matters is only ASEAN Outlook. The rest can try to squeeze themselves properly, whether it's in line with our concept of AOIP. But the most important part is the AOIP, the one that we consider as the most transparent, the more open, not aiming towards cornering anybody, should be the sole concept to be implemented in the region. The last takeaway is about the strengthening of Indo-Pacific. But we consider it is time for us to bring the greater Indo-Pacific to be that in the. Actually, we would like to bring the cooperation, the Pacific region, the cooperation, as well as the cooperation. Again, this is another example that we want to have very transparent, open concept. Okay, last but not least. Hope it's last slide. Terima kasih. Myanmar. Like it or not, although from the very beginning, from January when we assumed the role of the chairmanship of ASEAN, for time, our foreign minister always mentions that we don't want the issue of Myanmar hijacking our chairmanship. ASEAN is too big to fail and only to discuss about one particular. However, at the same time, we also understand the magnitude of Myanmar issue is that big. We need some more time and energy to discuss it properly, especially internally among ASEAN member states. It's a long story. I hours for. I even almost changed the Myanmar division forces. But the most important part is that when we are talking about Myanmar situation now, the only bar, the only standard that remains agreed by all ASEAN member states is about measuring it from the implementation of 5-point consensus of 2021. Many colleagues questioning whether 5-point consensus remain relevant, whether it should and create another norms by the military authority or other stakeholders of. But for ASEAN member states, it is not as simple. 5-point consensus from April 2021 is something that is already been agreed by all 9 leaders of ASEAN plus 1 military authority leader. I'm not calling it 10 different. 9 and 1. But at least everybody on board. The problem now is about the implementations. So that's why rather than creating something new, we need support from all stakeholders, from international community, even from other countries outside the region, national, maintain focus to give more impetus. 5-point. Because that is the most important part that we still have in order to measure whether there is a development or not in Myanmar. So far, we as a chair, we engage with all stakeholders. I can say all military authority, ethnic arms organizations. They lately they call themselves ethnic rebellion organization (RO). Then we also separately or one by one with ethnic groups, Rohingya representative. The most important part for us is to try to push for possible inclusive dialogue. After 2 years of conflict because of the coup in 2020, we consider time for all stakeholders in Myanmar to really sit together, especially after we spent time and efforts for the last 7 months now, meeting with everybody. So it's time for them to have a really inclusive dialogue, even maybe not with a certain goal first, but this just for the sake of having a meeting among them. The thing that we are trying to, still difficult, but and then we also still condemning the violence going. Yeah, there is a problem in terms of how we differentiate between violence conducted by military authority, conducted by others. Sometimes everybody claim that they are only responding to violence, but for us, violence is violence. Just stop it, and we talk from there. Then humanitarian of your situation also still our radar. We want to make sure that the humanitarian aid received by all in Myanmar without any differentiation. So that's it. Maybe something that something that I need to emphasize as the closure is that Indonesia is not in the business of megaphone diplomacy. That's why sometimes we have a problem in projecting what has already been done so far, because some of the activities are still ongoing, even under the radar. We go dark. We meet with us here and there, discussing some possible topics, but it is not something for the consumptions of public, because we consider maybe we still need some room to make sure everybody comfortable coming to the possible inclusive dialogue. So if you didn't see clearly what have been done by Indonesia or by the foreign, doesn't mean that we didn't do anything. It's just the time is not really there yet when we can reveal openly what we have been done, what will be the result of. Maybe that is can share as the initiative. I'm open for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Roy. I think it's interesting to see how much effort and work the MOFA and as well as other ministries has to put into making the whole ASEAN Ministers Meeting as well as its post-ministerial conference into reality, because it's a lot of work, as you were saying. But I think another important point is that what I can note from Pa Roy's presentation is that there are a lot of outcome deliverables. There are approximately 20-ish documents put out, as well as there are a lot of key takeaways that we can look forward to that we will adopt in the upcoming ASEAN Summit. For example, ASEAN Concord 4, which I believe is something that a lot of observers have really looked forward to, given that for the last few chairmanships, ASEAN has always ended its chairmanship with the release of a Concord. And we're very, very hopeful that the next Concord will prepare ASEAN to address whatever challenges that will be in the future. So thank you, Pak Roy, for giving us such comprehensive presentation on what really went on last week during the series of the meetings. And now we will turn to Pak Faisal Karim, who will discuss scrutinizing the AMM from a political security perspective. Pak Faisal.
Thank you, Mabda. First, I would like to thank this is my second time to go back to. But first of all, I would like to congratulate Pak Roy and the teams, Foreign Affairs. Not really easy to convene, ASEAN ministerial meeting or being the chair of ASEAN, especially if you are Indonesia. Why? Because ASEAN is always relevant, but sometimes the history of ASEAN, some of period of ASEAN, it may not be relevant, because we know that in 1998, for instance, crisis, people ask, where ASEAN? But somehow, every time Indonesia being a chair, try to always make us know that in 2003, ASEAN creates what we know as a ASEAN Economic Community, right? It's because of Indonesia idea or vision to encourage such reinterpretation of ASEAN, being more in ASEAN kind of an institutionalized organization. And also we understand in 2011, Asia has also created, how to make sure ASEAN being always central to evolving regional order. We know that as Indonesia proposed RCEP, part of the economic strategy in order to maintain geopolitical relevance of ASEAN. And now we are kind of in the same situation in which there is a growing rivalry happening between China and the United States, always be there, and in fact, getting more intense. Not only that, we can see in the global context, Russian-Ukraine war, or a Russian invasion of Ukraine, to some extent also created a more kind of a vulnerable geopolitical context that ASEAN face. So a lot of pressure at the moment for Indonesia to really maintain. And next, I find that I'm not gonna discuss everything, but I think there are 4 points from 31 pages of the communique, the joint communique that interest me. Or the first one will be, we're going to discuss, about ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. I think Pak Roy has already elaborated quite very well about how basically Indonesia, through ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific, try to create a new norms, right? As a way to maintain, stability in the region, a very hotly contested rivalry. But I think, yeah, I think from my reading, if I'm not mistaken, Pak Roy, there are 3 main takeaways, right? First of all, how ASEAN try to explore potential institutional cooperation. So it's not merely a cooperation itself, but institutionally related with other institutions that have been there or existing. Since ASEAN try to manage how East Asia's summit, for instance, right? And Pak Roy said ASEAN Regional Forum really relevant when it comes to understanding in a broader part, because ASEAN Regional Forum back then focusing on Southeast Asia per se, that it's evolving in East Asia Summit and so forth. But now the discourse is shifting. We're not talking about East Asia anymore. India, Japan, the United States try to encourage the new notion of geopolitical imagination called Indo-Pacific. In that sense, there is a lot of works to be done. ASEAN requires a lot of energies in order to make sure that institutionally it is relevant. That's the first one. And the second, I think, in the joint communique, it also stated about the importance to engage more to other institutions that might not be relevant back in the day, but now it's getting more intense. For instance, the Pacific Island Forum. Why is it important? Because see, it's not only ASEAN or Southeast Asia that becomes of a battleground for rivalry between China and the US. In fact, in the Pacific Island, in intense, see how China went to Pacific Island, offer a lot of things, and that to some extent creates kind of different dynamic when it comes to overall geopolitical situation in. So that's, and I think a joint communique already addressed that. The thirdly, I think is more in line with our developmental agenda, is basically focusing on the, because at the end of the day, even though Indo-Pacific is a kind of geopolitical construct or geopolitical objective, then it needs to be backed up very strong economic cooperation. I think in this sense, say that ASEAN try to enrich, the Pacific with a lot of initiative, but at the end of the day, I find there are 2 contested initiatives here. First, in the Pacific, in terms, this case Quad, they also try to create their own imagination of what is Indo-Pacific economic frameworks would look like, even though it might be different from what our understanding, because they're focusing more on a very high. But we can see, the contestation there. But I think it's good to see that ASEAN now also try to push forward the same agenda, the way that it might be relevant to talk about digital, to talk about economy within the framework of Indo-Pacific. I think that is my understanding of ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific that Indonesia or ASEAN try to pursue. In terms of ASEAN political security community, still relevant, even though amid the growing notions of ASEAN in the Pacific outlook. But I think it comes to ASEAN political security community, I found there are 4 things that interesting takeaway. First of all, ASEAN still continuing to focus on the plan of action, use or counter radicalization. I think people might not forget, but this are the most important or pressing issue facing by the Philippines, and still there. And I think Pak Roy has already mentioned quite a lot about ASEAN Maritime Outlook. I think my perspective is quite different. I think ASEAN Maritime Outlook is kind of a way for Indonesia to maintain the importance of its territorial integrity. Why? Because when it comes to, let's say, IUU fishing, a lot of Southeast Asian countries, they don't really on board with Indonesia because they thought, because this is kind of a issue of IUU fishing is kind of a between brothers, between Southeast Asian countries. At the end of the day, whoever country who get our fish, basically our. So in this sense, having ASEAN Maritime Outlook allows Indonesia to always pressure our national interest. I do hope that ASEAN Maritime Outlook can be achieved, then we can have a more kind of a normative principle that being here by many, by all Southeast Asian countries, and at this moment, I think we can get interest of Indonesia, especially in maintaining issue of territorial integrity. The establishment of ASEAN Coast Guard Forum, in my perspective, also kind of reflect the way how Indonesia try to demilitarize South China Sea, because we know there is a kind of a contestation internally within Indonesia between Bakamla and also Navy in a that how we can see South China Sea, is it a territorial sovereignty issue or is it kind of a law enforcement? And forcing the establishment of ASEAN Coast Guard Forum, I think it enables Indonesia to really demilitarize, or at least the discourse of military can be reduced when it comes to discussing of South China Sea. Of course, it have economically benefiting us, have a lot of cooperation with China, but at the same time, this strategy allows us to also maintain pressure from domestic issues, a lot of is back to a sovereignty issue. By demilitarize it, I think it's good for what I said, having kind of a win-win solution. And last but not least, I think the issue of illicit activities, so on and so forth, yeah, still there, and I do hope that it's an old wine in to bottle in a way, because at the end of the day, it's persisting part of the ASEAN security. These four main takeaway that I found from seeing the so again as well, there is a way, there is also kind of an idea to allow ASEAN lines to make it relevant within global agenda. So I found that ASEAN tried to implement the complementary roadmap, is a roadmap made by UNESCO, also creating for sustainable development studies. So basically, part of the Indo-Pacific Outlook as well is part of Dodo idea of being a power in the zero carbon energy and so on and so forth. So it's there. The important thing as well I find is that ASEAN tried to also reinventing again what we know as an intra-regional cooperation. Now, ASEAN try to focus more on having kind of a non-mainstream partners such as Gulf countries, also partnership with Chile, so on and so forth. So I think it's good thing to make sure that ASEAN more relevant and by expanding and international organizations. Next. Yeah, there is also major concern. So it being listed, just like Baroy already said, it's all about South China Sea is a elephant in the room. Somehow it's not really addressing China. That's the way how ASEAN works. We really point a finger to anyone, but it's there. South China Sea has important issue being discussed, or one of the major concerns. Other than that, there is also the development of Korean Peninsula. It's been part of the ASEAN. Shows that ASEAN always try to make that East Asia order always been part of discussion, engaging with the development Korean Peninsula, and I already said about development in Myanmar. I'm not going to go into detail on that. Situation in Ukraine, as well as situation in the so in that sense, major concerns has been discussed quite extensively in communication. So, so what's next? So after we look at the joint communication, so what's next? First of all, my understanding situation ASEAN face is basically it's still, even though it's still relevant, nobody really denied that, but it still need a major overhaul to remain relevant as regional organization. Because cannot deny how intensive or intense, yeah, U.S.-China rivalry somehow without looking at importance of ASEAN, these two countries have created their own regional image. The U.S. Somehow creating a quad, yeah, without halting. I'm probably ASEAN halted, but overall, public's view, the idea of quad, the idea of AUKUS seems to undermine ASEAN-centered regional order, even though we can see publicly US keep always telling the ASEAN policymakers that they always support ASEAN. But in reality, we look at the reality, US along with India, along with the Australia, to some extent Japan, try to create their own vision how basically such regional order undermine China. In this case, I think we need to look at the trend in ASEAN. Of course, we maintain ASEAN way and ASEAN. At the end of the day, ASEAN has been very widely, right? We can see, authoritarian regime, how Myanmar, Cambodia tend to side, well, Brunei and Thailand to some quiet, even not really supporting China, but it seems like they are. While Indonesia, Philippines, and Singapore and then take more active role to take board into a regional order, while Vietnam playing a very very critical for China, maintains a very dependent economic relation with China. So this is a reality thing. What I agree on regional level always reflects such fragmentation with. More importantly, if you will look at from 2013, 2002, so roughly gap, there is a growing militarized region. Of course, ASEAN, I think at the end of the day, if you look at the data from IIS, there is a huge acquisition of military hardware by this Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and right. Roughly, according to this estimation, 60 billion US dollar has been spent for such new toys for modernization. Of course, people argue that this is kind of modernization, still below the 2% in all countries. Still, farming in a way that such objective is basically balancing against China. People might argue that military modernization, but nobody can deny such a militarized region may affect toward rivalry. There is also strategic consideration at play here. No comprehensive overhaul of the organizational, doctrinal, and operational look armed forces toward deterring or fighting China. So again, what is it for? Is it purely defensive? Is it gonna be part of the growing rivalry in the region, or is it growing trend more a militarized region without trust, kind of a issue? Next, here's the thing of my last slide: challenge of order contestation. How to make sure that ASEAN government can really maintain hedging, because hedging is kind of a new mantra for ASEAN in order to maintain. They always try to hedge China, has put support with it, but how long such hedging strategy lasts? Secondly, hedging is known for strategy all powers toward a great power. Are we gonna look at hedging as a for grand strategy, or hope at or that the grand order to make sure that way great power rivalry? Today, I think Martin Atalagoa has dynamic. Basically, Indonesia tried to make sure the point or the equilibrium within dynamic. This new ASEAN, what idea that Indonesia ASEAN has our own grand strategy. Last but not least, I think this is a kind of a despite the challenges, despite a lot of criticism toward ASEAN, lack of much do about nothing, things like that. But still, I think from the academic perspective, ASEAN elite diplomatic culture, how ASEAN diplomats having 300 things like basically try to working in establishing an elite diplomatic way that their centrality then probably socialize US, China framework that hopefully know that Indonesia top one city of everyone, and growing rivalry. How can we ensure that diplomatic culture ASEAN can basically accept it? I think I leave it there. Hopefully, we can have a discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Karim. I think it's a really comprehensive review of the outcome of the meetings, especially the joint communication. And I would like to highlight there are a lot of important points there. One of them being what does the AOIP mean for within the context of the joint communique? What has been achieved through under the APSC, the political security pillar, as well as what does the joint communique achieve in terms of expanding cooperation with regional and international organizations, or so to speak, diversifying the sort of partners and organizations that ASEAN can engage with. And also the last slide, I think it highlights quite an important point that I think circle back to Pak Roy's remark, in that sense that in terms of discussing diplomatic culture in ASEAN, ASEAN has achieved quite a lot in habituating dialogues among ASEAN diplomats, and I think that's something that we can appreciate. But it also goes back to the old debate on ASEAN. What does ASEAN promote? Does it promote process or outcome or result? Is ASEAN an organization that can be assessed by the fact that it has habituated this habit of dialogue, talking among ASEAN diplomats, or should we just appreciate the outcomes or results that has come out of ASEAN? And I think that's an important topic to be discussed on its own. But of course, lastly, I think your point on hedging is quite important as well, because your question on how do we manage geopolitical rivalry in a way that make ASEAN still relevant, I think it's a question that I believe Roy will have to answer as someone working in the MOFA. But I think that's something that has been discussed quite a lot as well in the last few years, given that it can be said that to some extent ASEAN has yet to really display how it will position itself if, I mean, God forbid, something unfavorable happen in ASEAN, for example. So in that sense, I think that's a nice segue to the next presentation by Mr. Faisal, who will be talking about ASEAN Foreign Ministers Meetings, outcomes, and Great Power Politics. So Mr. Faisal, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you. Okay, just to check again, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a great honor to be here. Very good afternoon to everyone present. Very good afternoon to Pak Roy, to Professor Faisal Karim, and many thanks to Habibie Center for the kind invitation for me to speak at this conference. So I will be giving a short presentation about the ASEAN AMM and great power politics. Next slide, please. So the 56 AMM was an important and inclusive platform for ASEAN to promote multilateralism and to help develop solutions for current difficult problems. I think the AMM has shown inclusivity compared to other groupings such as the G7, Quad, or Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which are mostly exclusive and lie at the opposite ends of the geopolitical spectrum. So for AMM, we have seen at the side meetings where foreign ministers of geopolitical rivals like Anthony Blinken, Sergei Lavrov, and Wang Yi meeting and talking with other political leaders. Developing solutions, however, seems like a more Herculean diplomatic effort for AMM and ASEAN. These problems, I feel, are difficult not only because they are intra-regional, but also because they overlap with power politics in the wider Indo-Pacific region. The Myanmar crisis is one example. No doubt this is an internal problem that undermines ASEAN unity and credibility. I see that under Indonesian chairmanship, we can see that ASEAN is doing much more to mitigate this crisis, despite the lack of levers that ASEAN has on the junta. But it is difficult if at the same time the junta is reportedly receiving military and diplomatic support from great powers like China, Russia, and some say India. It appears that some external powers who are ASEAN dialogue partners prefer business as usual with the junta because it serves their respective strategic interests, and each of them want to be poles in a multipolar world or deepen their influence in Southeast Asia and nearby region. This make the sub-region there, Myanmar, India, China, a frontline for great power politics. Next slide, please. So the 56 AMM happened at a time when the world is becoming increasingly multipolar, where confidence in the multilateral rules-based order is declining, and great and middle powers increasing military expenditures, where powerful states publicly call for responsible competition, but have different interpretation of what this means, while constantly challenging each other in the military, economic, and technological domains. The fact that the Indo-Pacific is a theater of the US-China competition, and European states and Russia trying to shape regional views about the war in Ukraine means that ASEAN is increasingly at the center of great power competition. The entry, the recent entry of Sweden and Finland into NATO could draw Russia closer to China and Asia to counter NATO's strategic reach. NATO is also upgrading its ties with some ASEAN dialogue partners, namely South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, under the tailored partnership programs. Therefore, ASEAN is facing multiple challenges due to this great power competition. And these challenges are not only those that ASEAN members are facing, but also those relating to external powers' perceptions of the role and effectiveness of ASEAN. Next slide, please. It is true that external powers all say that they support ASEAN centrality, but they may have different understanding of what this means. It could be an acknowledgement of the geographic centrality of Southeast Asia in the Indo-Pacific. In that regard, they may think that they must live with ASEAN to pursue their respective interests in the Indo-Pacific. But this is quite different from external powers actually viewing ASEAN as being useful or the main driver to address regional security concerns. Acknowledging ASEAN centrality could also mean that each great power believes it is important to entrench ASEAN in their respective spheres of influence. Today, ASEAN still lacks some resources to be a provider of public security goods, including in emerging technologies and health, like vaccine distribution. So, alongside the impression that ASEAN principles hamper progress, this gives great powers the opportunity to prioritize their own frameworks, such as a Quad, AUKUS, IPEF, BRI, and Global Security Initiative, to drive their respective engagements in our region. ASEAN's neutrality, impartiality, and autonomy may be seen as useful by the great powers only if these serve their own strategic interests. It is important for ASEAN to emphasize to the great powers that ASEAN would work with their interests as long as their interests are beneficial to ASEAN's collective interests and do not transgress international law and the UN Charter. I feel this emphasis has been mentioned in a few paragraphs in the joint communique of the 56th AMM, which has several takeaways. I would like to focus on two takeaways. Next slide, please. The first takeaway is on the South China Sea. Paragraph 130 states that ASEAN is seriously disappointed over the failure of the non-aligned movement to update paragraphs on the South China Sea. Now, this begs the question of whether non-alignment is the rejection of control by great powers of the time or choosing to maintain inaction or lack of action as long as possible, even when international law such as UNCLOS and the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity are being violated. Paragraph 139 states that ASEAN looks forward to the adoption of the guidelines for accelerating the early conclusion of an effective and substantive code of conduct in the South China Sea. This implies that ASEAN is very aware of the long delayed code of conduct being a key factor in the uncertainties and the risks of military calculations at the South China Sea. The question is whether these guidelines will be followed through and whether ASEAN and China have the same goals in reality. ASEAN definitely want to ease tensions. China, however, may be using the negotiations as a tool to show that it is a consequential and resident power in the region compared to the US, while maintaining engagements with ASEAN to grow economic ties with the region. I'll argue that the discussions that happened during the AMM on South China Sea did not just happen at the meeting. As a demonstration of power, I believe the negotiations were also happening at the South China Sea. Before the AMM, the Philippines reported an alarming increase in the number of Chinese fishing vessels in the disputed waters in the South China Sea. And I think even after the AMM, there has been presence of Chinese PLAN vessels as well as the largest Chinese Coast Guard vessel in the vicinity. Next slide. Next slide, please. The second takeaway is on technology. The AMM Joint Communique noted that ASEAN's efforts to develop an enabling environment for a robust ASEAN digital economy and strengthening regional digital integration and transformation. Of concern for ASEAN is that China and the US dominate the global digital economy and various parts of the digital technology value chain, such as the semiconductors and AI development tech. So, great power politics will impact ASEAN's digital agenda. For example, both the US and China cloud service providers see ASEAN as a battleground for market share. Relatedly, the United Kingdom's MI6 chief recently said that countries making deals with China that involve data sharing are vulnerable to the risk of coercive influence and to their sovereignty. And a lot of these countries are those in Southeast Asia and the wider global south. US China rivalry in artificial intelligence means that ASEAN countries need to think properly about which technological solutions is best for them in terms of price, security, functionality, and strategic interests. Relating to the digital agenda is also space and other emerging technology. which is increasingly a domain of great power competition and, as we have seen in Ukraine, crucial during times of conflict. Paragraph 46 of the communique noted ongoing multilateral discussions on emerging issues, including involving international peace and security, such as outer space. Now, during the side bilateral meetings of at the AMM, the South Korean Foreign Minister and the Indian Foreign Minister met and discussed critical and emerging technologies. With the Brunei Foreign Minister, the Indian Foreign Minister also discussed space cooperation. And during the period of the AMM, separately, the Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim had a virtual meeting with Elon Musk about providing Starlink satellite service to Malaysia. Now, space tech is not only important for ASEAN's digital agenda. The cyber and kinetic attacks on critical information infrastructure in Ukraine and the suspected cutting of submarine internet cables at Taiwan Strait show the importance of satellite internet for defense and resilience of people and public governance. So I think it may be a matter of time before ASEAN have to form a collective position if there is an escalation in issues relating to space security and diplomacy, in particular between China and the US. Next slide, please. To conclude, the world is watching whether the ASEAN-led forums like AMM would result in more substance rather than just focus on formalities. This is all, I believe, because we are facing unprecedented geopolitical challenges and the world is becoming more dangerous. So naturally, more countries and external powers demand solutions. ASEAN needs to show that it can raise and move current and emerging issues instead of just being a convening power. So external powers are watching how ASEAN is performing, including whether there will be any concrete developments between the 56th AMM in July and other high-level meetings in September and later this year. I would say that the centrality and credibility of ASEAN is like a coin. On the one side, it is whether our member states have a united voice, and on the other side, it's whether external powers or our dialogue partners regard it as a useful forum to address issues of regional peace and stability. Next slide. That's the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention.
Given that ASEAN has put quite a lot of emphasis on digital transformation, digital development, bridging digital gaps between ASEAN member states. But more importantly, I think at the moment we are seeing quite a lot of interesting development in terms of critical and emerging technology, which will probably, or a lot of predictions have stated that it might become a new domain of competition. And to some extent, I think we've started to see how that materialize and become a tool of conflict. And some of the most representative example being AI and outer space technology, as Mr. Faisal said. And at the moment, I think ASEAN has started to pick up these trends. And if I'm not mistaken, I think ASEAN is building a guideline on AI, for example. There are also a lot of other issues pertaining to cyber technologies, for example, that ASEAN has started to show some sort of interest in this regard. So I think it's important to see where this is heading. But I think one thing that I can pick up from Mr. Faizal's presentation is the importance of, aside from appreciating ASEAN for the process that it allows the different member states to take part in, but also the fact that I think we need to highlight the importance of ASEAN in addressing actual issues rather than merely appreciating its convening power. And I think it's interesting to know that all of the presentations given by the three highlighted a lot of important, not only issues that we have seen to persisted in the past few years, but also new and emerging issues. But I think we will move on to the discussion session, which afterwards we will open the floor for questions and answers from the audience. So I think I would like to go with Pak Roy first because I think Myanmar is an issue that all speakers highlighted as an important uh, issue that up until now, I think this is the third year we are seeing ASEAN discussing this issue. And throughout the past few weeks or months, I think we are seeing quite a lot of important um, developments going on in terms of Myanmar. I think particularly, I think Thailand's engagement with, for example, in the most recent example, the Thai foreign minister recently embarked on a series of meetings with junta officials as well as Aung San Suu Kyi, which I believe Pak Ngurah Swajaya says in a statement as something that is conducive with the five. But that aside, I think aside from that meetings, I think starting from December last year, there were reports of Thailand conducting informal meetings as well, involving the junta as well as other ASEAN member states. And I believe that Indonesia declined to be involved, which I think in that sense, I think it's quite known to the public that ASEAN member states do not necessarily agree on everything revolving Myanmar. And you have also said that the bottom line is IPC, for example. But I would just like to understand from the standpoint of the Indonesian the Indonesian MOFA, to what extent have particularly endeavors on the Thai part hardened the divisions ASEAN member states, or to what extent do you think has it hampered the sort of wish to really center all pursuits to five peace?
Thank you. First, I have to so for other colleague joining the meeting today, seems you have full understanding with it. Really appreciate from us, the one that from zero, having a battle colleagues. Government side, well, whether a colleague will agree or not, that's different. You have a proper time to with the content document. This for me personally, the most important part is paragraph 149, which is looking forward for the next meeting in Lao, which is actually that's the mark of that later on to Lao colleague. With regard to Myanmar, Magda mentioned, but I will not say. I mean, different for different approach, maybe reflect how try to. But please don't forget that when we are agreeing 5.1 years ago, actually it's not about social contract between the nine with the one. I mean, that's the most important part, of course, because we consider there is the one member of problem in homework. This is something where you can coming back living happily ever. But that's the bar, the standard. But the problem, 5 point, not problem. The status is the least common denominator. There were, or even there are, ASEAN member states that from the very beginning want to have stronger measures, for example, directed towards them. On the other hand, there were, and they are ASEAN member states who wants to have a stronger content, 5-point, because everybody has its views. Especially maybe the slight difference in terms of those countries directly connected in the border with Myanmar, and it's fine. Yeah, we work under no illusions that as if we can see everything from. But the most important part, these 5 points, the least common denominator, should always be collective guidance, collective standard, in order to measure of course, there are already several major decisions taken not by foreign ministers, but ASEAN leaders for the past 2 years, and one of the most notably a notable document out of the Phnom Penh summit last November, and there are of the leaders, so including the so-called determining. So practically, is the only agreement that we have. Whether each and every ASEAN member want to complement using their own national approach, ASEAN. However, it is not, at least from Indonesia's point of view, that any national or approach from any member states come out should not doing, and certainly facing 5 points. Is it the only that we have tried to emphasize with regard to, I'll call it Thailand? I'm not going to deal into whether it is, as long as everybody still put in a proper. I think I can. Okay, I think I will stop there for Myanmar.
I'd like to hear what Faisal has to say, because I think you briefly touched upon Myanmar, but I would just like to hear what are your thoughts on these recent developments and what it potentially contributes, or probably what does it say about ASEAN in general.
Thank you. I think come back to whole debate, different audience approach, right? Comes to how to deal with Myanmar, pressing it exactly yard really think active as thought more democratic Myanmar, which is basically on right path up until 2020. Through journey of a model for Myanmar democracy, thought that case, and thought that process, but process will win basically. we need to be very patient about food. At the end of the day, if we process right, great. But it turns out, one order and those and more aggressive in how Indonesia wants to show to Myanmar and to the world that also kind of feel good about more being back to authoritarian regime. Having said that, so how can we still look at the process, or whether look at these debates? Country like national community thought that 5 is being freed, and Human Rights Watch, for instance, opponent of human rights, failing. Faisal has already how basically their mind going to, great power, war from China, so forth. So in that sense, I don't know. Probably we need more. I think from academic. So I think we need more looking more not aggressive point the approach may best approach against policy making. Yeah, if it's gonna be Asian audience, democratic front obviously not that for foreign in general, not really that assertive. Western style lot of things, but if not that active engagement is take same route, have consensus delivered, I think the time will engagement resolve.
I think we will circle back to Myanmar probably during the Q&A session, but I would just like to ask Mr. Faisal on his take on US-China rivalry. Exact. I think amidst current dynamics, I think it's quite clear that all ASEAN member states share a similar concern on US-China rivalry. I think the Shangri-La dialogue is the speeches that was delivered by the ministers from ASEAN are quite clear in that they express concern over the possibility of anything that is in our favor erupting in the region, as well as potentially any sort of conflict, for example, over Taiwan. And I think it's quite clear that there is this concern shared among the member states. But I think it's also important to note that despite all of these, as I was saying, and also as was highlighted by Faisal, for example, as well as Mr. Faisal, there is quite a lack of clarity on what ASEAN can do, or what can we do collectively as ASEAN member states collectively can do to address these challenges. And my question to Mr. Faisal is that to what extent should we be hopeful that ASEAN will be able to, if we are generous with our expectation, to play a role, or at least not being caught or trapped in the middle? For example, if Taiwan in 1 or 2 years become an inflection point in the rivalry, what can we do? Or otherwise, if the South China Sea becomes the inflection point, what can we do? To what extent are we prepared in the cases that this 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 uh, this dynamics erupt into something that we wish would not happen?
Ah, thank you for the question. That's a very interesting and a very challenging question. You mentioned about the Shangri-La dialogue. Yeah, it was. I was there too. So it was a very interesting event when we listened to what Secretary Austin said, and a day later when General Li Shangfu gave his speech. Um, Secretary Austin, in his speech, to me, what was very glaring is that although he was addressing the region, I find that most of his speech was dedicated to countering an adversary without mentioning names, and about emphasizing the strengthening of American alliances, the hub and spokes with his allies in this region as well as new partners. There was very little mention about ASEAN, which brings me to the question whether when the US talk about ASEAN centrality, about the value of of ASEAN to as a bridge with China, whether how much to what extent they actually see it seriously. For China, I think General Li Shangfu was quite smart in mentioning ASEAN quite a number of times. And in his speech, he didn't really talk about like fighting the US. He was actually talking more about how they can contribute to ASEAN, how China can contribute to ASEAN, how China supports multilateralism. It's actually the opposite of what Secretary Austin was saying. I would say that what ASEAN can do for at the moment is quite limited. We have to try because we are ASEAN and this is our region. We do not want instability or conflict to happen here. We have to try. We have to reach out to both powers, be it as a region or even at the bilateral level. For example, Singapore, US, Singapore, China, Indonesian, US, to remind them that we do not want to change sides, to remind them that Southeast Asia is a zone of peace and neutrality, to remind them that both great powers must do something to manage their competition. That is the least we can do. We have to be realistic that there's a limit to what we can do. And honestly, in my view, if both great powers, China and the US, hit our advice, they would have done so already. But as you can see in the recent weeks, even as some of the senior leaders, for example, General Shangfu met with the US senior diplomat, then a few Anthony Blinken went to China. I mean, these are all diplomatic overtures. But at the back end, we can see that in reality, the competition is still happening at quite a high level. The US is still thinking about exerting some more sanctions, tax sanctions on China. China has been like clamping down on US companies operating within its borders. So the competition is still happening. We try our best, but to the best of my observation, I think the US and China isn't really listening to us. But we have to try. But we also have to be realistic. We need to prepare for the possibility that some miscalculation will happen. And it's good if our ASEAN leaders can somewhat try to plan or envisage what are some of the possible scenarios that can happen, uh, say at the Taiwan Strait, at the South China Sea, how this could affect our trade, our own Southeast Asian economy, our trade, our citizens, and what we can do to help each other if something like that happen. I think that's something which ASEAN as a region, as a organization, both at the senior levels, the political level, as well as the working group levels, need to start thinking about it. I'm sure they have started thinking about it, but probably need to start thinking deeper about it.
And I think we can, of course, I think we will, a lot of the questions probably will US-China rivalry, but I would just like to give quite a bit of time for the Q&A. So if any, yeah, we can accept all three questions.
Yeah, okay, thank you. My name is Rio. I'm from Universitas Gadjah Mada. This is for Mr. Faisal and Mr. Faisal because it's pretty much a theoretical question. With the recent joint communiques and previous statement in May, at least from my perspective, I think there is a norm-making process. So, if we are going to ask about substances, values, and etc., I think ASEAN is very still focusing on the process, the meaning before focusing on the goal that will be justified by the meaning. And this is also still taking into account from the speaker's response just now. So with that, can we see ASEAN as a norm entrepreneur? Are we going to make for example, the COC or the 5-point consensus or whatever product it will result from the ongoing process as let's say like the ASEAN ASEAN NWFC nuclear weapon free zone norms. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm Puji Asuti. I'm a former of national analyst, Indonesian. We'd like to the two big challenge is the shifting balance of really. Then the two is the program of undertaken by ASEAN state. The resulting prospect for an interaction. To know your opinion, sir. Is there no possibility to ASEAN set up ASEAN defense pact or only defense and security cooperation like now? This is only my question. Thank you.
Ya, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Musliman. I come from Kumen and I'm from Dutch team Butomo. And now I want to ask about an ASEAN conflict like in Myanmar. Also the technology that is me. Technology like perubahan also another. So what I ask is, what is our action or our action for the ASEAN conflict? So an Indonesian future to in the future becoming true, our dream in independent conference. Okay, that is from me. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Just to be clear, so your question is what is Indonesia's potential conflict? Is
Yeah.
that correct?
Yeah. Thank you.
So we have three questions. Will outcomes from ASEAN meeting, a lot of will outcomes from ASEAN continue to be a part of this norm? And also we have from Puji Astuti, these big challenges, is there ASEAN defense pact? Potential question for ASEAN as well to some extent. That's an interesting point to create as well. Lastly, all of these are we prepared to some extent, have the capacity to address challenges, but also collectively within ASEAN. So I think I will give the floor to Faisal to answer.
Okay, for Rio, yeah, I think we can argue that ASEAN is a platform for our countries, norm entrepreneur. The way that it's like Pak you already said as well, how ASEAN can authority setting up the agenda, how such agenda can be convincing enough so that everyone's on board that agenda. So in that sense, I think I would argue whether ASEAN can form and platform depends on how active and how innovative countries take that platform. Because this has been a very long process in the making. Have regional order revolving around ASEAN past 35 years. After the Cold War, as building has been there, so such investment will not just go the window. Problems is how whoever being chair deliver such powerful ASEAN. So in that sense, I agree with you. But how effective and how efficient they're different. I think in that sense, India is still one of the countries that hopeful who are hopeful always can new ideas always in a way that it's always relevant with the current situation. For Pujiastuti, probably Pario will have more light on this, but I think having ASEAN back might not be a argue is ASEAN defense strategy. Kind of a being the same strategy, kind of a dominator. Vice versa, have kind of then why ADM is important because having that kind of a talk, it's kind of a normative similarity at least. Having said so, it can be go forward to other, let's say, maritime outlook, for instance. That's outlook because are different in ASEAN. Same goes modernization. Must be outlook, same strategy, mind. At least at the normative level, people knows that kind of a keep balancing it, making sure the regional study.
Um, Mr. Faisal, do you have any response to the questions?
Thank you, Mabda. Okay, I'll just provide some views for the questions. On the first question about ASEAN being a norm entrepreneur, I agree with what Pak Faisal initially said earlier. I think being a norm entrepreneur is a very relevant and will continue to be a relevant value for ASEAN, not just within ASEAN, but what ASEAN can offer to the rest of the world. Because when we talk about norms, we are talking about basically keeping the spirit of multilateralism alive, keeping the spirit of multilateral order alive. We are now living in an era where there is declining confidence in multilateralism. So if we keep this process alive, we can be I believe, not a perfect one, but still a beacon of multilateralism, of international cooperation to the rest of the world. ASEAN itself is the least that we can do to keep the world safe. And we have seen before about some of the norms that ASEAN has created, such as the Code of Unplanned Encounters at Sea, guidelines for the air military encounters. We just have to make sure, just have to push on with the process for, in particular, our dialogue partners, the great powers, to not just accept them in principle, but actually to put them into practice. Now, on the second question about whether we can set up the ASEAN Defense Pact, I think this is not something that has been a new issue. I think it has been floated in the past in different forums. But it's quite clear that ASEAN is not an alliance. We are more of a community. And if within the region, if we worry about the intentions of increased military expenditures or military modernization, I think this is where ADMM itself is becoming increasingly important, and therefore member states should continue to invest efforts, or even invest more efforts participating in ADMM platforms, so that we are very clear and able to continue trusting each other about our various intention. Furthermore, if we do set up some sort of ASEAN Defense Pact, I am pretty sure the Western powers will be quite glad to see this, because they have certainly seen that ASEAN is doing more to balance against external threats. But I think we can expect some sort of quite negative response from China, because China will probably wonder whether ASEAN has changed its tack and trying to be one of the blocs that's trying to constrain China's growth. And China might respond even more aggressively at places such as the South China Sea, the disputed waters itself. And some of our front-facing ASEAN member states like Vietnam and Philippines will face the brunt of such reactions. Last question about whether ASEAN have what it takes to address future potential conflict. I think it pretty much depends on how ASEAN performs in the next few years. Even now, I think ASEAN needs to start thinking about how to address the Myanmar issue and other issues relating to it. Because firstly, next year Laos will take over the chairmanship, and Laos is a close neighbor of Myanmar. Will Laos actually continue the many good efforts that Indonesia has started this year? Will there be continuity? That's a question about continuity. If we face a problem with continuity of our efforts, then it's quite difficult for ASEAN to actually even think that we can well manage future challenges within our region. Then secondly, what are we going to do when it's Myanmar's turn to take over the chairmanship, especially if the junta is still in power? Are we going to accept it? And how are we going to manage it? And how are we going to manage the response from our dialogue partners? So I'm pretty sure quite a number of them will find it quite difficult to engage with ASEAN at the various platforms if Myanmar happen to be the chair. And even in the next 1 to 2 years, if at the dialogue partner level, if Myanmar happen to be the co-coordinator with another country on certain issues, how will our dialogue partners see it, and how will they engage with the region? How do we manage this? So how we actually manage all these different but interrelated issues in the next 2 to 3 years will pretty much determine how well ASEAN will be able to manage other internal problems or internal conflicts that will happen in the region in the future.
Roy, do you have a response to the?
Yeah, maybe a bit scattered, but I tried to give several takes from my point of view. And by the way, I will always encourage colleagues also try to check the content of the ASEAN Charter. Under my current capacity in job descriptions in my office, it's obligatory for me to bring this charter everywhere. I will encourage everybody to look on this. So many things actually still can be done based on the ASEAN Charter. But of course, sometimes the issue is the devil is always in the detail. How we are going to derive actual steps, concrete measures based on the charter, for that to, let's say, to problem, address challenges. I will take the issue of so-called decision making. Article 7 clear. ASEAN Summit, our leaders can do anything. But the question whether we need to wait our leaders to come up with their enlightenment, their ideas, or whether we should do something in order for our leaders to do something, to present the case. Is something that is not really well defined in current charter itself, especially when the so-called consensus is not met. Take it to the of charter. That's why sometimes the question whether ASEAN is too slow because the consensus. Actually, the question is not about consensus. Consensus will always be the DNA of ASEAN. Consensus and is written in the charter. We will not shy away from that principle. But how we are trying to define it properly in order not to hostage the steps that should be taken by ASEAN, that's the thing. That's the homework that we're doing it. That's why under in chairmanship, one of the biggest, let's say, priority that we are now still conducting is how to improve working methods, especially with regard to this. Not only with regard to Myanmar, but in general. Can you imagine if we still defining the so-called consensus in a rigid way, whether we are going to be able to adapt or to address immediate future challenge that comes to our table when we have some difference being the situation. So that's the issue. But anyway, when it comes to the issue of possible conflict and whether ASEAN can resolve it, actually we can see it again. Chapter 8 on the charter clearly defined the settlement of how to the settlement of among ASEAN. Also, we should also come back to the TAC itself. We have the mechanism, the high contracting parties, the TAC, not only members of ASEAN, but also partners that already adhere to the TAC are practically bound in how they have to behave in the region. When actually we can or we should, maybe not we should, we can close our eyes with regard to other partners' behavior outside the region. But when they come to our region, they have to abide by the social contract that they have already. Then the 2011 Bali Principle, the mutually beneficial relation. Practically, even we in this is only my own visions, not all the. I mean, if our partners from outside the region have their own, but please leave it the door. They are coming. The least they can do is they do not distract the relative peace that have already been created by ASEAN for the last 56. That's the least. So that's the issue of conflict. When it comes to the process and result, I mean, we should always be able to at least trying to keep the delicate balance. Because at least for me, I personally, the process is already conducted in such a proper way, at least the result will not be far away. But of course now, dynamics in the region are very changing very rapidly. Ibu Retno, a couple of days ago, the currency global region situations clearly indicating a possible Cold War. Keep discuss it in when that particular. So and again, it comes down to us whether we, ASEAN member states, will always be truthful to ourselves, keeping the unity. So the centrality is only part of the unity part to be taken into consideration. Under the current circumstance, the unity is also being tested. Of course, we are not working under the illusions that ASEAN will practically immune, that practically ASEAN state will live in a silo, not connecting to living on the illusions. But the one thing that we should emphasize, any proxy special relations with other countries region should not be conducted at the expense of ASEAN Unity. The other problem is about this so-called ASEAN centrality. I can give you an example that now so many ASEAN-led mechanisms, RF, ADMM, MTC, mention it, all those abbreviations, ASEAN, slowly but surely being hijacked by our partners. Because maybe they have their own thought on how they are trying to take benefit as much as possible. But again, that's the temptation. Most the important part is ASEAN should not give away all those ASEAN-led mechanism control. It should be based on our need. If you're coming to the again, this is personal. If you're coming to the restaurant, ASEAN who should determine the a la carte menu, not the coming and their own. So lastly, Ibu Puji, with regard to the possible and defense pact, I mean, as a diplomat, I was taught to say never say never. But the problem for ASEAN, I can assure you that it is not intended to go to that. Even if we might remember in the so-called ASEAN Chief of Defense meeting, not the ASEAN sectoral bodies meeting, still put under one of the. So it is clear indications that we have no go to that. We're going into more personal thought of.
I just went today. I would just like to ask one closing question, and very briefly, please, to both Faisal and Faisal. And I have another question to Roy as a closing statement. To Faisal and Mr. Faisal, given that this year's chairmanship will be last for policy moment, very briefly, what do you think the chairmanship this Jokowi's performance in the foreign policy front?
I think this legacy comes to how basic this can we priority growth visions post pandemic. Importantly, forward to economic cooperation that as before is not quite ASEAN, and I think it will always be part of 5 years. It's there. Bodo domestic hub and yeah, so I think this 7 don't know both parliamental.
Faisal? Surfing from Singapore.
Well, I can share my personal view. Personally, I feel that President Jokowi has done pretty well during Indonesia's the current chairmanship as ASEAN. I feel that when it comes to managing internal issues like Myanmar, uh, the, cur- the current chair has actually done much more than what the previous chairs have done, in my view, in actually taking steps that matter including in terms of trying to channel humanitarian aid for example, to Myanmar. And I feel that President Jokowi has articulated very strongly and very clearly about how ASEAN should not be an arena for proxy war between the great powers. This, I feel, is something which wasn't articulated that strong under the recent in the last few years, and what President Jokowi said should be like a guiding statement for the future uh, ASEAN chairs. And I find it very interesting and impressive that while uh, the war in Europe is currently happening, the fact that uh, President Jokowi has reached out to like Russia, to Ukraine, to help to mitigate the issue, uh, it is something which I feel is not just an exercise of Indonesia's foreign policy, but it's also something which the President Jokowi had done to help to address the wider strategic issue, including economic energy that affects the whole of Southeast Asia. So, personally, I think Indonesia, as a current chair under with President Jokowi, has done a lot, done pretty well. Not perfect, but I think it's very well given the circumstances.
Thank you very much, Magda. Thank you very much for enlightening me, all speaker. Uh, when meaning of chairman decided to quite a long title, long theme priority, actually already by its on to ASEAN for its people, especially in facing the challenges, current and while also at the same time maximizing in order to become a epicentrum for the regional but global. The case during the clearly indicate that our region has own resilience degree quite high, directly what do you call it impacted COVID. Of course, we are not immune, of course, but at least we have certain degree of resilience in addressing the impact, the negative impact section. In the future, we should positioning ourselves. Maybe it is time for us to work even stronger collectively in order to make sure being a player that defining global economy, especially since collectively we can position as a big player any aspect, being building a system for the be part of that big global deal. Close our eyes and concentrate. If overall. So again, particular will be even beyond. Because again, we separate chairmanship and leadership. Leadership not only from all ASEAN should be materialized among others by the capability keep balance changes all those positive moments, positive aspects, positive issues that have already been brought to the table, but also at the same time not allergic changes need for the two deals with it. And for example, when we are talking about more in a couple of years, there are some questions whether ASEAN is already more or work enough in the area of especially protecting. Promoting is one thing, but continue. For changes, we need to make sure maybe how we can implementing AOIP in all various aspects, only maybe an economic, but the political, something that is even maybe needed the current global dynamic. But we deal it together. At the end of the day, ASEAN member states are the real inhabitants. We are here to stay. Thank you.
Roy, so it's an important point. Last point is really important. We are here to stay, and it's important to ensure that we are able to have the authority to say what we want and what we want to do in this region that is our own, the others, right? So thank you, Pak Roy, Mr. Faisal, for your insightful presentation, Q&A session. And that concludes our discussion today. So thank you everyone for joining online and offline. And also to the speakers for taking the time to come to Kemang, which I know is very both Pak Roy and Pak Faisal, and for Mr. Faisal for taking the time to join. So thank you and see you on the next Talking ASEAN. Bye.